Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bogart of Aspect Ministries, where we're all about promoting effective 21st century faith. You may recall from my previous introductory videos about the Chosen series that I explained some basic features that pop up throughout the episodes. For instance, we've looked at what it means to be a Jew, the close connection between the Old and New Testaments. We've talked about keeping the Sabbath and the oral versus the written law in both ancient and modern Judaism. In this video, I want to explain something that many people have wondered about, and that is those confusing groups among the Jews mentioned in the Gospels. I'm talking about the Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, scribes, publicans or tax collectors, Zealots, and the Sanhedrin. Plus, even though they aren't explicitly mentioned in the Gospels, I will throw in the Essenes as well. Since there are so many groups, I need to break this video into a couple of different parts, so bear with me. As I've said several times before, people have a problem in viewing the Chosen series. Not the Chosen itself, but the fact that 2,000 years have passed since Jesus' times. So many changes have taken place since then. Now, many layers of culture and historical events separate us from what we read in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. So a 21st century person living in a very different time and culture naturally struggles a bit with understanding the customs and historical setting of the gospel accounts. These videos simply attempt to explain some of those things that prevent a full appreciation of the Chosen and of the Gospels themselves. So let's jump right into it. Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and Zealots. Who were they and how did they interact with Jesus? We'll start with the Pharisees. Pharisee is a term that comes from the Hebrew word prushim and seems to mean pure ones or separated ones. They were known for a very strict and inflexible interpretation of the Torah, which they attempted to enforce on other Jews. This sect of Jews probably formed sometime during or shortly after the 5th century BC, by the way, that would be the 400s BC, as a reaction to the Jewish exile in Babylon. Now, before the exile, the prophets had warned that God would allow a catastrophic judgment come upon his people because of their abandonment of the covenant that he had made with them on Mount Sinai. The exile involved the siege of Jerusalem, the deaths of tens of thousands of people, and the forced deportation of the surviving Jews out of their homeland to Babylon, where they remained for 70 years or so, from 606 to 536 BC. Some of them remained far longer than that. After the hardships of the exile, some Jews were determined that no such disaster should happen to them again. So they set about the task of keeping the laws of the covenant very strictly. So strictly, in fact, that they spoke of building a hedge around the law, making and keeping rules more detailed and strenuous than God required. The idea was that if people kept these stricter rules, that they would never then be tempted or in danger of breaking the covenant again. I discussed some of this in a previous video when I talked about the oral law. So the Pharisees were all about strict keeping of the law of Moses, including the extra rules of the oral law. What did the Pharisees stand for? Well, they saw themselves as the guardians of both the law written in the Torah and of the oral law passed down by the elders, which they believed was handed down by God as well and was therefore equal to what was written. They stressed that the law was to be lived in every aspect of life, from worship to business to food and family life. Because of their strong beliefs, they regularly spoke out against any infractions of the law that they saw or thought they saw people committing. In essence, they were the religious thought police of the first century, at least among Jews. Other principles that they held to including belief in angels and in the afterlife, and their acceptance of all of the books of what most people think of today as the Old Testament, unlike the Sadducees, for instance, who focused mostly on Genesis through Deuteronomy, the Torah. Though the Pharisees had reluctantly adjusted to life under Roman occupation, they were generally hostile to the Romans, just as they had been to the Greek occupiers before them. Now, if you know anything about Jewish life and practice today, it was the Pharisees who laid the foundation for what developed into current rabbinic Judaism, Orthodox Jews of current times carry on many of their traditions. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived a generation after the time of Jesus, estimated that the total number of Pharisees in his day was only around 6,000. That's a pretty small number considering that the Jewish population of the times numbered in the millions. So you can see that they held a huge influence over the Jewish people, even though they were relatively small in number. From the start of Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees were suspicious of this upstart rabbi from Galilee. As Jesus' popularity expanded, their suspicion grew into loathing and ultimately into a plan to kill him. I'll explain why a bit later. Now moving on to the Sadducees. The term Sadducee came from the name Zadok. Zadok was the Israelite high priest who crowned Solomon king over Israel and consecrated the temple when it was built by Solomon. The Bible records that Zadok and his descendants were fully devoted to the pure worship of God and were never tempted into pagan worship that so often accompanied the life of many other Israelites at different times in the Old Testament history. These Zadokites, or Zadducees, were a tight-knit group of priests and Levites whose main concern was the preservation and purity of temple worship. As a side note, the Greek language of the New Testament calls them Sadduceos, but for some reason, the English translation comes out as Sadducees. It's a funny name, I know, but just keep in mind that they were all about the temple and its rituals, performing them properly and keeping them pure. I mentioned priests and Levites, so I'd better pause for just a moment and review who these people were. So originally, Israel was made up of 12 closely related tribes, all descended from a man named Jacob, who was the grandson of the patriarch Abraham. These tribes included famous groups like Yehuda or Judah, Benjamin or Benjamin, Ephraim or Ephraim, and Levi or Levi. From the time of Moses, the Israelite tribe of Levi was set aside to oversee Israel's worship and teach people God's law. They were in effect Israel's clergy. They had no territory like the other tribes, but were scattered among the other tribes to represent God and His covenant. Now, besides teaching the law, most of the Levites also maintained the temple and served in its functions. Each year they were called up for a certain period of time from wherever they lived to serve in shifts at the temple. However, one family among the Levites, the family of Moses' brother Aaron, was set aside as the priests or Kohanim. They and they alone performed the actual rituals and sacrifices at the temple. Jewish people today with surnames like Levi, Levitz, and Levinson maintain their Levite connection, while people named Cohen maintain a priestly tie all the way back to Aaron. Like the Pharisees, the Sadducees disliked the Roman occupiers of Judea, but unlike the Pharisees, they were willing to cooperate with the Romans in exchange for being left alone to oversee the temple rituals and sacred ceremonies. It's hard to know for sure, but reading between the lines, it would seem that, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees were established after the exile, and they took their inspiration from the legacy of Zadok. They vowed to reestablish pure worship in the temple when it was rebuilt. But by the time of Jesus, some 500 years later, the original devotion to God had been diluted by the power, wealth, and prestige that came with their privileged position. They become elitist and self-interested. And among the Jewish people in general, the Sadducees had a reputation for being corrupt, self-serving, and unconcerned about the people themselves. They seemed to live lives of luxury and were perceived as removed from the problems of average people. Sadducees were also hostile to Jesus and his teachings. They ceased to exist, though, as a group when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD. Next, the Herodians. The Herodians do not seem to have been involved with Jesus as much as the other groups, though they are mentioned several times in the Gospel accounts. Though less is known about them, the Herodians were probably not focused on primarily religious issues or practices. They were more of a political party who supported Herod the Great and his successors. Like most other Jews, they desired independence from the Romans. But unlike most other Jews who wanted some sort of restoration of David's kingdom, the Herodians looked to establish the family of Herod in power over the region, but not under Roman domination. Instead, they wanted to be allies of Rome. They were hostile to Jesus, and they fully endorsed his humiliation and execution. Okay, the last group for this video will be the Zealots. They seem to have been both a religious and a political entity, but they absolutely hated the Romans, so much so that they were involved in terrorist-like activities against them, killing off-duty Roman soldiers, raiding Roman outposts, etc. Think of the Taliban or ISIS in our own times, or think of the French resistance to the German occupation of France in World War II. Their purpose was to get rid of the Romans and any Jew that collaborated with them. After Jesus' time, the Zealots were in the thick of the Jewish revolt against Rome in the 60s and 70s of the first century, which was put down by the Romans under Vespasian and Titus. The Zealots were finally defeated in the 130s of the AD period when they made their last stand at the fortress of Masada. It's unclear what the Zealots as a group thought of Jesus, but at least one of them found him intriguing, Simon the Zealot, who became one of Jesus' disciples. So why were the Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and others so hostile to Jesus and his message? At the time of Jesus, these groups held positions of great authority and power over the Jewish people. They saw Jesus as a threat to that power and the integrity of their faith, and maybe even to the future of Judaism itself. They accused Jesus of blasphemy against God, since he claimed that God was his direct father. The Pharisees were angry, for instance, that he deliberately violated their traditions, which required extreme rules that were not even in the written law. The Sadducees were furious that he drove out the money changers from the temple. Money changing was a huge source of revenue for them. They were also probably alarmed when he said that the temple would be destroyed, but that he would raise it up again in 3 days. Of course, Jesus was not threatening to destroy the temple itself, as they assumed, probably. But as he so often did, Jesus was making a veiled reference to his own body, his death and resurrection 3 days later. The Herodians were alarmed, perhaps, that Jesus sided with his cousin, John the Baptist, against the corruption of the Herod family. And the Zealots? Well, they may have been displeased that Jesus never did what so many people wanted him to do: gather an army and drive out those hated Romans. But that explains only part of their animosity. There's another side to why these groups hated Jesus so much, which I will explain in the next video as I continue to talk about the groups who opposed Jesus. In the meantime, don't forget to check out my other videos on YouTube, like my 5-minute Bible guides, in which I give simple but impactful chunks of information about the Bible and related topics. Also, take a moment to visit a couple of my websites, which I think you'll find very interesting: aspectministries.com and undiscoveredbible.com, where you'll find an array of helpful and thought-provoking articles, media, and more. I hope my insights in this episode have been enlightening and have deepened both your appreciation and your enjoyment of The Chosen. Until next time, this is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. We'll see you then.